Welcome back students to today's lesson of 9th standard history. Today we'll be seeing the lesson India Events after 1960 module 1. Let us have a look at the key points that we are going to discuss in this module. We are going to be seeing India, the political and economic developments that took place in India in the 1960s, the 1970s and the 1980s. India became independent in 1947 and very soon after that our lawmakers started making the constitution, and accordingly we accepted the constitutional framework and became a sovereign democratic nation. We became a nation which was multicultural. People belonging to various languages lived here together. People belonging to various religions, ethnicities, meaning smaller communities and races, and castes. We all live together in this sovereign democratic India. However, we find that during the initial period after independence, India needed to solve different issues of economic, political, and social development. Now, how did India solve this problem? And what type of problems did India face in economic, political and social field? When the British left India, they saw that India's treasury was empty. So when we became a new country, we had no money with us. We also faced shortage of food grains and unemployment and poverty. Hence, the lawmakers decided, the government decided that first they would set up the planning commission. And accordingly, the National Planning Commission was set up and they made short term and long term plans for the development and progress of India. And they put a lot of emphasis on industrialization, that is, setting up new industries, as that would solve two problems. We would be able to achieve economic development and it would also help to eliminate poverty, as people could get jobs in the industry. So that was how the government tried to solve the problem of economic problems. The country also faced the problem of political instability, and hence to solve it, the government successfully conducted elections, and when people came out in large numbers and voted, it showed that they had faith in the democratic traditions, and hence the political stability could be achieved. The other problem was the problem of social development. That is, in India's society, there were a lot of weaker sections who had been neglected from many centuries and they had been treated with a lot of injustice. Hence, the government made some reforms that included the policies and programs to improve the condition of the weaker sections of the society. So, this is how the government tried to solve the problem of economic, political and social development in the period after independence. Now let us see the developments that took place in India after the 1960s. In the decade of the 1960s, that is from 1960 up to 1969, several events occurred which had a huge impact on the political situation in India. For example, the first event that happened was that the regions of Goa, Diu and Daman were freed from the Portuguese rule and they became parts of the Indian Federation. When the Britishers had left India in 1947, there were the Portuguese who were still in India at that time, and it was only in the year 1961 that they finally gave the freedom to the colonies of Goa, Diu and Daman, and these three areas became part of the Indian Federation. The next event was that the tensions between India and China had been on the rise since 1950, and it is only in the year 1962 that the war between these two countries started, and the area of divide between India and China was the McMahon line. Now, China refused to consider this as the international border and it tried to enter into India and conquer the areas over here, which is why we find that there was a fight between India and China in 1962. After India became independent, Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru led the country. He was the architect of India's foreign policy. His contribution to the social and economic development of India is quite significant. However, the country suffered a great loss when we lost him and he passed away in 1964. So, it was Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru under whom India after independence had continued for so many years up to 1964. After Jawaharlal Nehru passed away in 1964, it was Lal Bahadur Shastri who succeeded him and became the next Prime Minister of India. During his tenure, India and Pakistan went to war in 1965, and the war erupted to such a great extent that the Soviet Union had to mediate between the two countries. Lal Bahadur Shastri at that time, to boost the morale of the people and the soldiers, had given the slogan Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, which highlighted the importance of Indian soldiers and Indian farmers. In his words, he said, I quote, "The preservation of freedom is not the task of soldiers alone. The whole nation has to be strong." Unquote. However, this great man breathed his last at Tashkent in 1966. After the death of Lal Bahadur Shastri, Indira Gandhi became the Prime Minister of India in 1966. During her tenure, Pakistan's oppressive policies in East Pakistan resulted in a big movement. Now, just look at this map here, children. As you can see, after independence, Pakistan was separated from India, and this portion was West Pakistan and this portion was East Pakistan. So, Pakistan had started its oppressive policies in East Pakistan, and because of which the people over there had started a big movement. This movement was led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and his organization called as the Mukti Bahini. This crisis in East Pakistan affected India to such a great extent that we had millions of refugees coming to India because of the oppression that had happened. And so ended the decade of the 1960s. The era of the 1970s began with the continued tensions in East Pakistan. As a result, the Indo-Pak War was fought in 1971. This led to East Pakistan separating from Pakistan and becoming an independent country called Bangladesh. India won the war, and thus the new country of Bangladesh was created. The decade went on, and as a part of India's policy to use atomic energy for peaceful purposes, India successfully carried out an underground test of an atomic device at Pokhran in Rajasthan in 1974. In 1975, the people of Sikkim voted for joining the Indian Republic, and Sikkim became a full-fledged state in the Indian Federation. During this decade, that is the 1970s, the political situation in India grew unstable. The Allahabad High Court gave the verdict in 1974 that Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, had misused the government machinery during her election campaign. This had led to nationwide strikes and protests. During this period, the situation became more complicated due to the movement led by Jayaprakash Narayan. Jayaprakash Narayan was a political activist right from the Quit India movement times. He had followed the political developments in India after independence as well, and was keenly interested in the progress of the country. The situation of law and order in the country worsened, and the government had to declare a state of national emergency on the basis of the constitutional provisions relating to emergency. During this turbulent period, the fundamental rights of Indian citizens were suspended. Due to the national emergency, the Indian administration became disciplined, but the human rights were restricted. This period of national emergency lasted from 1975 to 1977. The final decision to impose an emergency was proposed by Indira Gandhi and agreed upon by the President of India. This emergency refers to a 21-month period from 1975 to 1977 when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had a state of emergency declared across the country, officially issued by President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad under Article 352 of the Constitution because of the prevailing internal disturbance. The emergency was in effect from 25th June 1975 until its withdrawal on 21st March 1977. This order gave the Prime Minister the authority to stop conducting elections. Also, the civil liberties, that is, the rights of the people, were curbed. During this time, many of Indira Gandhi's political opponents were imprisoned and the press was censored. Several other human rights violations were also reported. On the backdrop of the emergency, many opposition parties came together and formed a party called the Janata Party. The Congress Party, led by Indira Gandhi, was roundly defeated by this newly formed Janata Party. Morarji Desai became the Prime Minister, and he was also the first non-Congress Prime Minister. Under the leadership of Morarji Desai, the Janata Party government couldn't last long due to internal differences. Similarly, the Charan Singh government, which succeeded him, was also a short-lived one. Elections were conducted once again in 1980 and the Congress Party, under the leadership of Indira Gandhi, came to power again. During this decade, the Indian political system faced many new challenges. The Sikhs in Punjab demanded an independent state of Khalistan and began a movement which went on to become violent and destructive. Pakistan had lent its support to this movement. The Indian government came to know about it and secretly started a mission by the name of Operation Blue Star. The Indian army was sent into the Golden Temple at Amritsar, a holy shrine of the Sikhs, in 1984 to evict the terrorists who had allegedly taken shelter there. One of the Sikh bodyguards in Indira Gandhi's personal security assassinated her later on. This was a period when an organization called the United Liberation Front of Assam, the ULFA, carried on a major movement in northeast India. Right after Indira Gandhi's assassination in 1984, Rajiv Gandhi became the Prime Minister of India. He tried to make several reforms in the field of Indian economy and that of science and technology. He took the lead in solving issues of the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka. He promoted the idea of a united Sri Lanka with internal autonomy to the Tamil community, but his efforts in this regard proved to be in vain. He also faced a lot of criticism in the context of corruption that took place during a defense equipment deal, especially the purchase of long-range cannons from a foreign company called Bofors. The political corruption became such a crucial issue in the general elections that followed that the Rajiv Gandhi led Congress Party was defeated in the general elections of 1989. Soon after, while Rajiv Gandhi was campaigning for the next elections, he was assassinated in one such election campaign by the Liberation of the Tamil Tigers Illam in 1991. After the defeat of the Congress in the general elections of 1989, several political parties formed a coalition called the Janata Dal. Vishwanath Pratap Singh became the next Prime Minister of India. The policy for providing reservations for the other backward classes is considered to be his most important contribution. However, he could not continue as Prime Minister due to the internal differences in the party. After Vishwanath Pratap Singh, it was Chandrasekhar who became the Prime Minister of India in 1990. His government was also short lived. In 1991, during the election campaign, the terrorist organization in Sri Lanka, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, had assassinated Rajiv Gandhi. It was during the end of this decade of the 1980s that the unrest in Jammu and Kashmir had begun. The terrorist activities there forced the Kashmiri Pandits to leave the valley, and this problem grew serious day by day, and today it has taken the form of terrorism. Let us take a quick recap of the different decades of the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, and also see under whose leadership the country progressed. So, as we see, in the 1960s, we had the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru, which was soon followed by the country under the leadership of Lal Bahadur Shastri, followed by Indira Gandhi. This rule of Indira Gandhi continued in the decade of the 1970s at the earlier part, and it was followed by the country going under the leadership of Morarji Desai and then Charan Singh. In the 1980s, we find Indira Gandhi coming back to power, but soon the leadership changed and we had Rajiv Gandhi who became the next PM, and then we find it was Vishwanath Pratap Singh, soon followed by Chandrasekhar. Thus, we saw the journey that India progressed in its political and economic fields from the decades of the 1960s to the 1980s. This is all for this module, children. In the next module, we will continue with the next part of the lesson. I would request you to go through the lesson, read the text well for this part. Let us look at a few questions based on this module. Give reasons. First, the Morarji Desai government lasted for a short while. For this answer, children, you have to go to that part, after the emergency, when the Janata Party was formed. Actually, after the emergency, the popularity of the Congress party had come down, and at that point of time, many opposition parties had come together, and they had formed a party called the Janata Party. And this Janata Party had defeated the Indira Gandhi led Congress party, and Morarji Desai became the Prime Minister, who was from this party. But since it was a gathering of many opposition parties together, they could never come to a consensus or take a decision. Hence, because of a lot of internal differences, the Morarji Desai government could last only for a short while. The army had to be sent into the Golden Temple in Amritsar. The second question. For this answer, children, we have to go to the part, the problem of Khalistan. Yeah. So, the Sikhs in Punjab had demanded an independent state of Khalistan, and they had began a movement which had become violent and destructive. Along with this, Pakistan had also lent its support to this movement, and it was during this time that the government had given permission to the Indian army to enter the Golden Temple at Amritsar, as they had got information that terrorists were hiding there, and hence the army had to be sent into the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Read your textbooks well, children. Thank you for listening to this module and happy learning.